So again, this is the lipids section of your note catcher. Um, and again, this is number 11 in the note catcher. All right, so lipids. So if you recall from our amoeba sister video earlier this week, there was that little mnemonic device that they gave us, and it was like cho, cho, chan, chomp. Remember that? So carbohydrates are CHOs, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen only. Lipids are also CHOs, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the atoms that make up lipids. So, how are they different then, right? If there's the same stuff in them, what makes them different than a carbohydrate? Well, they are what we call hydrophobic. Literally, the word hydrophobic means afraid of water. What that really means in the real world is that it is insoluble in water, meaning that lipids do not dissolve in water. And you know this if you ever had Italian salad dressing, you always have to shake up the bottle before you can actually use the dressing because otherwise the oil and the vinegar part separate from each other because oil does not dissolve in water. Lipids, oils, fats, waxes, these things do not dissolve in water. They are hydrophobic or insoluble. Now, some people may say that monomers don't there's not a true monomer for lipids. Other people say that they are. They just have two of them. The building blocks of lipids are the monomers of lipids are both fatty acids and glycerol. So glycerol and fatty acids get together and make lipids. When they get together in certain different types of combinations, we can get fats, we can get oils, waxes, steroids. Now we don't have to talk about like the illegal steroids that bodybuilders use or anything like that. Like our bodies naturally produce steroids. Triglycerides. If you or maybe somebody you know or love has issues with their heart, they're always told that they have to watch their triglyceride intake. Not good for the heart. And then, of course, the phospholipids. And as the name suggests, it's a lipid that also has some phosphorus in it because that's such an original name. Just saying. All right. So, what is the function of lipids? So, remember, we said that carbohydrates are short term energy, they do some structure stuff. Um, they can store energy in glycogen and cellulose, right? So, these are the things that carbohydrates did. So, what do lipids do? Lipids are for long term energy storage. Again, we talked about this yesterday. We talked about fat bears in the fall time. So bears literally will spend their entire summer and fall overeating on purpose and making themselves fat because bears hibernate in the winter. During the winter months, bears, whatever den they're living in, whether it's a cave or wherever they've chosen to hole up for the wintertime, literally sleep and get up to go to the bathroom. But what they don't do is they don't go hunting, they don't go foraging for food. So whatever fat they build up throughout the summer and fall months as they are purposely overeating, that is the energy that is going to sustain their life processes throughout the winter months while they are hibernating. Phospholipids, super important because they make up our cell membranes. And remember, like all life is cellular. So there is no life without cells. So there's literally no life without lipids. And finally, another function of lipids is that they're basically waterproof because they're hydrophobic. So we get these really nice waxy coverings on plants. Sometimes we see that in bird feathers. I mean, think about it. Like we've all gotten stuck in the rain and then our clothes get wet and they stick to us and it sucks. Imagine being a bird out in the world like flying around and it starts raining. If your feathers got wet, then it would weigh you down. But what happens with bird feathers is that they have a lipid covering, a wax covering, and literally the water will streak right off and they don't really get wet. It's kind of like they have their own waterproofing because of the waxes, because of these lipids. Okay. So Many lipids are formed when glycerol molecules combine with fatty acids. Not every single one, but a lot of them. So here is what it ends up looking like. Let me get my controls back. All right, so what ends up happening with a glycerol. So we have a section which is the glycerol, and then to the glycerol we connect fatty acids. Fa for fatty acids. So we have the glycerol and we have the fatty acids. So what I've drawn here is actually a triglyceride because it's one glycerol with three fatty acids. If it was a diglyceride, there would only be two fatty acids, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is pretty much the structure. You will have the top or the head of the lipid, and then you'll have your fatty acids that almost look like little tails connected. Now, clear on the drawings. Here we go. Turn this off. Awesome. Okay, so what ends up happening then, ladies and gentlemen? So, what are the different types of fatty acid? I'm sorry, the different types of lipids that exist. So, there are saturated. I'm sure you've all heard of saturated fats. We've heard of unsaturated fats, and you may have even heard of polyunsaturated fats. We hear a lot about this when we talk about nutrition, when we talk about our diets. Saturated fats basically happen when all of your carbon bonds are saturated, meaning that you have as many carbon bonds as possible. In other words, there are all single bonds on my carbons, and we can see that right here. Saturated fat tends to be solid at room temperature, and they tend to come from animals. Okay, so animal fat is usually saturated fat. If you've ever seen, for example, like a steak prior to it getting cooked, you see like the solid fats, like the white part of the steak. By the way, delicious. Um, in that steak, when you bring it out of the fridge to, like, season it or whatever, at room temperature it is a solid, like it's solid. However, we also have these things called unsaturated fats, and what we see in an unsaturated fat is at least one double bond, and we can see that right here. And so the fatty acids connected to the glycerol in an unsaturated fat has at least one double bond. Okay, actually it has one double bond. These tend to be liquid at room temperature. So right now in your kitchens, you probably have vegetable oil or canola oil or olive oil, some kind of oil that maybe your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, whoever your adult in charge is, cooks with. That oil that they cook with is an unsaturated fat. It is a liquid at room temperature. And again, these are all general tendencies. Obviously, there are some plant fats that are solid at room temperature, but whatever, we'll get there eventually. And then polyunsaturated fats have many double bonds. Polyunsaturated fats are usually, we get these out of processed foods, and they are considered usually to be the most unhealthy fats to eat, just so that you know. So, like, if you're having like a steady diet of, like, Twinkies and Ho-Hos, you are probably consuming quite a few polyunsaturated fats, and you may want to consider better nutritional options. But again, single carbon bonds are saturated. These tend to be animal fats, and they are solid in room temperature. A double bond inside the fatty acid will denote a unsaturated lipid. They tend to be liquid at room temperature. They tend to be coming from plants and usually fish. And then the polyunsaturated fats have many double bonds inside the fatty acid, and these tend to be fats that we see in processed foods and generally considered to be the most unhealthy fats of the bunch. Come on. There we go. All right, so we are now at number 13. Different lipids have specific functions. Okay. So fats and oils. Fats and oils basically are energy storage devices. So I always tell people I'm not really fat. I am just, getting ready for winter. I'm a bear. No, no, I'm not. I'm overweight, but that's okay. Fats and oils are energy storage. Not being funny, but even no matter how skinny you are, you do have some fats, some stored in your body somewhere. As a general rule, not that I suggest ever doing this because it's incredibly dangerous. Um, Humans can go usually about 3 weeks without eating before they actually die of starvation. And the
Right? Like way before I got in high school, like in sixth grade, my science teacher was like, "You can go 10 days without eating."
I, I mean, like, it's not like we actually do these experiments because that'd be really unethical and we'd end up killing people. Um, but as a general rule, I mean, I've always heard about 3 weeks, which would be 21 days. But again, that's for an adult. So maybe her number was for a child. And again, these are not exact numbers, right? Because the thing is, I mean, what we really do is we look at the average person, how much average fat they have in their body. And then we say, okay, well, you would require this much calories just to live. And then we do like the math backwards. So, I mean, these are just estimates anyway. So if I say an average of, 3 weeks, I mean, that means there could be people who die in like, a week. There could be people that die in 4 weeks. So again, these are just kind of average numbers. Anyways, they store energy. So, as a general rule, again, not that I suggest doing this, um, if there was a situation like a zombie apocalypse or whatever, something horrible happened, and there wasn't access to food, as a general rule, the people who had a little more stored fat would probably live a little bit longer in general because that is how we store our fat or how we store energy, much like fat bears in the wintertime. Your waxes are going to repel water. These are your natural water repellents. So, like, if you've ever bought like a pair of leather boots or a pair of Vans or Chuck Taylors, and you go and you buy this stuff at the store, and they always give you the waterproofing spray stuff to put on your shoes so you don't ruin your shoes if you're out walking around in the rain. That has a wax base. Now, naturally, we find this on leaves and bird feathers because they naturally do repel water. There are some animals that also have these in their furs, and they tend to be animals that spend a lot of time in the water, such as otters and beavers and things like that. Again, it's to repel water because lipids are hydrophobic, meaning that they do not dissolve in water, which means that they push water away. Steroids. Your steroids are going to include cholesterol. They are going to include your sex hormones, and they are going to include cortisol. So your sex hormones, of course, every human being has these. Every doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, man or woman. We all have estrogen and testosterone. Women, biological females, tend to have more estrogen in their systems. Biological males tend to have more testosterone in their system, but every single one of us have a little, like at least a little bit of both. Cortisol, on the other hand, is what we call the stress hormone. And one of the reasons why people are always talking about, oh, you need to manage your stress, you need to be able to relax, is because cortisol is a great hormone. When you are running away from like a saber-toothed tiger, it's a stress hormone. It brings up your body, it brings up your blood pressure. It makes your heart pump faster. It makes you more aware. It makes you more alert, and that's great in a survival situation. The problem is, like, me not getting my work done really isn't a survival situation. And so when you walk around with high levels of cortisol, it can be damaging to your health. So that's why oftentimes doctors are really recommending that people do things that help them relax and sort of de stress, because what we're seeing in more and more adult populations and even in younger children as well is these high levels of cortisol, which will have bad effects on your health long term. So, and it's all lipid. And then, of course, we have the phospholipids. The phospholipids make up your cell membranes. And again, no cell membranes, then there are no cells. And if there's no cells, there's no life. So people always talk about, oh, fat is bad. Like you hear like the nutritionists or the people that are like super into like, working out or whatever. Fats are bad. Fats are bad. Nah, no, they're not. Because without lipids, without these fats, we literally wouldn't have cells. And without cells, we'd all be dead. So I'd rather have a little bit of fats in my diet and be alive because my cells are happy. So moving on to number 14, which is the phospholipids. In my opinion, phospholipids, the most important lipid out there, because again, it is responsible for cell membranes. So phospholipids make up your cell membranes. The head is a water lover, hydrophilic. The tail hates water, hydrophobic. And we end up with a lipid, what we call bilayer. It's a two layers of these little phospholipids kind of lined up together. You can kind of see that here in the graphic. Um, the hydrophilic, the head part is polar, and the hydrophobic part is non-polar. And if you remember polar molecules, they have that slight attraction. And that makes sense because I want to attract some things from the outside of the cell to go into the cell because nutrition. And then if I have waste products inside my cell, I need to be able to attract them to go out of the cell so that I don't end up killing the cell with too much toxicity. So this phospholipid, this most important lipid, literally builds up our cell membranes. And again, all life is cellular. No cells, no life. And I don't know about you, but I kind of like life. So, as a living thing, I'm all about life. And again, they will pair up. This is kind of like a little GIF, whatever they're called, and we can see the phosphate group on the outside, and then those little fatty acid tails on the inside. All right. Any issues or questions on the lipids? Hearing none. All right. Quick little video, kind of surmising everything that I've just said.
So let's say you have to read an incredibly long email from your boss that you have to finish before the big meeting starts in 10 minutes. Lipids are a group of hydrophobic biomolecules that play important roles in living organisms. While the primary function of lipids is long-term energy storage, lipids are also used for protection, insulation, and lubrication. They also act as precursors for some hormones and are a key component of cell membranes. There are four basic groups of lipids. These are triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. Although these groups differ in many respects, they all have one characteristic in common. They are all insoluble in water. You may have noticed that lipids and water do not mix. For example, notice the yellow-colored oil in the beaker of water shown here? Even if we stirred this for several minutes, or even several hours, the oil would still separate out from the water. This is because lipids are hydrophobic. From Latin, the prefix hydro means water, and phobic means fear of. So when lipids are hydrophobic, water and lipids do not mix. Let's take a closer look at the category of lipids known as triglycerides. Triglycerides include the fats and oils. Fats, such as lard and butter, are solid at room temperature and are used by animals for insulation, protection, and long-term energy storage. Oils, such as corn oil and olive oil, are liquid at room temperature and are used by plants for long-term energy storage. At the molecular level, triglycerides contain two types of subunit molecules, glycerol and fatty acids. Let's take a quick look at fatty acids. A fatty acid has three main parts: a chain of carbon and hydrogen atoms called the hydrocarbon chain, a methyl group at one end, and an acid group at the other end. Fatty acids can either be saturated or unsaturated. A fatty acid that has only single carbon-to-carbon bonds is known as a saturated fatty acid. This is because the carbon chain is saturated with all the hydrogen atoms it can hold. Unsaturated fatty acids have one to several double bonds. Double bonds result in kinks in the fatty acid chain, which affects the melting point of the fat. Animal fats have saturated fatty acids and are solid at room temperature, while vegetable oils have one or more double bonds and are liquid at room temperature. A trans fat is an example of an unsaturated fatty acid where the hydrogen atoms are on opposite sides of the double bond. Trans fats are usually formed during the production of processed foods that are also common in partially hydrogenated oils. In order to increase shelf life and melting point of the fat, excess hydrogen atoms are introduced to an unsaturated oil. This causes the formation of trans fat bonds in the fatty acid chain. Unfortunately, the consumption of trans fats has been associated with cardiovascular disease, and its use has fallen from favor. Now that you understand a little bit about fatty acids, let's zoom back out and look at how the triglyceride subunits fit together. Remember, a fatty acid is only a small part of a triglyceride. To become a triglyceride, three separate fatty acids have to bond with a glycerol molecule through the process of dehydration synthesis. Let's move on to the next category of lipids, which is phospholipids. Phospholipids are similar to triglycerides in that they contain glycerol and two fatty acids. What's different is that a phosphate group, rather than a third fatty acid, is attached to the third carbon of glycerol. Phospholipids are extremely important, mainly because of their unique properties in regard to water. The phosphate head of the molecule is hydrophilic, or water-loving. This means that it mixes well with water. The fatty acid tails, however, are hydrophobic, or water-hating, and do not mix well with water. Because of these unique properties, phospholipids tend to arrange themselves so that only the hydrophilic heads interact with the watery environment, and the hydrophobic tails crowd inward away from the water. This structure is the major component of plasma membranes of the cell. Steroids are the next category of lipids. Steroids are composed of four fused rings of carbon to which different functional groups are attached. One well-known steroid molecule is cholesterol. Cholesterol serves as a precursor for the synthesis of other steroids such as testosterone, estrogen,
Very
vitamin D,
clear instructions.
and
Now, if
cortisol.
you're not a teacher, you're gonna be like, maybe you
Cholesterol
didn't
is
get the.
present in plasma membranes where it stabilizes the membrane. The hormones testosterone and estrogen have small differences in their functional groups, but large differences in their effects on an organism. Waxes are the final group of lipids. Waxes are nonpolar and repel water. They're found in the protective coating on leaves and on outer surfaces of animals. Wax is produced in the ears of some animals to protect the eardrum. In addition, bees construct honeycombs from wax. Now that we've covered all four categories of lipids, let's do a quick recap. The four categories of lipids are triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. All lipids are insoluble in water. While the primary function of lipids is long-term energy storage, lipids are also used for a multitude of other purposes, such as protection and insulation, and as a key component of hormones and cell membranes.
Riveting stuff. Riveting.